Right now, I'm going to read you a little something from a petition at change.org. Free Bogdan Syrotiuk. I'm not really going to be able to pronounce that properly. Syrotiuk. On Thursday, April 25th, Bogdan, a socialist opponent of the fascist Zelensky regime and the NATO-instigated Ukraine-Russia war, was arrested by the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, in his hometown of Pervomaisk in southern Ukraine. Bogdan, who is 25 years old and in poor health, is being held in a prison in Nikolaev under atrocious conditions on fraudulent charges of serving the interests of Russia. In fact, Bogdan is an intransigent opponent of the capitalist Putin regime and its invasion of Ukraine. He fights for the unity of the working class in Ukraine, Russia, and throughout the former Soviet Union. If found guilty by a kangaroo court of these charges, Bogdan is threatened with a prison sentence of 15 years to life, which is equivalent to a death sentence. The arrest of Bogdan is the latest example of the Zelensky regime's brutal repression of left-wing movements, whose opposition to the war is finding a growing response within the Ukrainian working class. The International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website call for a global campaign to demand the immediate release of Bogdan Syrotiuk. The fight for Bogdan's freedom is an essential component of the struggle against imperialist war, genocide, and fascism. This is a change.org petition that you can check out. Okay. Yes.
Thanks for reading that out. It's change.org/free Bogdan, which is just how it sounds, free Bogdan, and that will get you to the petition, which is extremely important. And I can talk to you a bit about the background of this and what it reveals about the reality in Ukraine and what's the reality of this war and the whole regime that the United States and NATO imperialist powers are funding and have been arming to the teeth in what is basically a proxy war against Russia that is now escalating in an extremely dangerous way for the entire world, but of course especially for Russia and Ukraine and for the whole of Europe. And I think the way that this war is being presented to everybody in New Zealand certainly, and Australia and the rest of the US allied countries around the world, is that Ukraine is a democracy and it has to be defended at all costs against the dictatorial Putin regime in Russia, which has invaded in what they always call an unprovoked invasion 2 years ago in 2022. And so you have this narrative which is all a complete lie. The idea that, starting with the idea that this was an unprovoked invasion, it was deliberately provoked, going back to the 2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine, which we can talk about a bit more maybe later. But then, since then, basically you had an anti-Russian government, a pro-NATO government installed by force, backed by fascists in the streets of, and as I say, flooded with weapons from the United States. And Russia responded with an invasion which we oppose in 2022, and this brutal war, which has been escalated by both sides. Now, our comrade Bogdan is part of the young guard of the Bolshevik Leninists, which is a socialist organization in both Ukraine and Russia, and I believe other parts of the former Soviet Union, which opposes the war. They oppose both the Putin regime in Russia and the Zelensky regime in Ukraine. From the standpoint that the workers of Russia and Ukraine have nothing to gain from slaughtering each other in the service of these regimes. On the one side, you have the Russian oligarchy that's determined to defend its wealth and resources, and on the other side, the imperialist powers, which are using Ukraine and the Zelensky puppet government, essentially, to try and inflict a military defeat on Russia, and ultimately to carve up Russia and to subordinate Russia and the entire region of Eurasia and Eastern Europe to the imperialist powers, to basically take their resources and establish US imperialist hegemony. And to do that, they are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian against Russia. There's growing opposition to this, as you read out in the petition, and growing support for our movement, our comrades there, who have been collaborating with the World Socialist website and the International Committee of the Fourth International, which publishes the World Socialist website. We've published their material in Russian and other languages, and opposing the Zelensky regime, opposing the Putin regime, and the escalation of this war, especially by the NATO powers. So what we are charged with, and this is not just us, there are thousands of people who have been imprisoned in Ukraine with allegations that they are somehow aiding Russia, many of them simply for expressing opinions on social media and the like, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or opposing the dictatorial and fascist measures of the Zelensky regime. I guess there's not a lot of coverage in the media here or anywhere else about the reality on the ground in Ukraine. It has been transformed into a police state regime by this war, started deliberately provoked by the United States and NATO, and Putin's reactionary invasion, as I say, played into the hands of those powers. The reason that this arrest, in our view, has taken place now is because there is a massive crisis of this regime. They are losing support. They've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or injured. The exact figure is a secret, basically. But we can say for certain that Zelensky's claim that it's only about 31,000 troops that have been killed is clearly just propaganda. There are earlier estimates from last year that it's more like between 300,000 and 500,000 total casualties on both sides, Russian and Ukrainian casualties. But they are running out of people to conscript into the military. There's hundreds of thousands of military-age men who have fled Ukraine, and the government is trying to bring them back if they can into the country by forcing them to go and re-register at the Ukrainian embassies around the world, and if they refuse to register for military service, then they'll have their passports cancelled. And if you're in Ukraine and you're not in the armed forces, there are literally squads of military recruiters roaming the streets, dragging people out of shopping malls and the like, and putting them into the army to be sent to the front lines, where you have a very high chance of being killed. All of this, as I say, is being escalated all the time by the United States, which is really determined that this has to end in a defeat for Russia. So far, the Russians, have made significant gains. They are in a war of attrition comparable to the First World War. There's no real movement on the front lines, just massive loss of life on either side. And but the response of the imperialist powers, particularly recently, the New York Times reported a couple of days ago, there is active discussion in the Biden administration of allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike inside Russian territory, something that Biden initially said he would never support because that would be an escalation that could lead to World War III. Now, there have been previous red lines against any sort of escalation. I think Biden has also said we're not going to send American troops, we're not going to send American planes or tanks, and each of those, there's a steady escalation, and when they say they're not going to do something, you can be pretty sure that they're discussing behind the scenes that that's exactly what they're going to do. This discussion, apparently Anthony Blinken, according to the New York Times, is arguing in favour of of allowing Ukraine to make these missile strikes into Russian territory. The Russians have recently been holding nuclear weapons drills, which they say is in response to the provocations of the United States and NATO. They are, in other words, indicating that they're prepared to use nuclear weapons. But according to Zelensky, that's nothing that should deter the European and American powers. He says, Putin will never actually do it, don't worry. Keep escalating, give us the weapons that we need.
To be clear, what we support is the unification of the struggles of the working class of the Ukraine and Russia. We support the unification of their struggle against both Putin and Zelensky.
Mm-hmm.
That's our basic position. But just to go back a step, I think one of the important things is to, as you alluded to, is to stress that we are not dealing with different isolated wars here. Just a couple of weeks ago, Biden put through and signed off billions of dollars of extra funding for the war in Ukraine, for the Israeli Defense Force, and for Taiwan, to prepare Taiwan as a sort of a launching pad for a war against China. So what we have is as far as the US ruling elite is concerned, all of these wars are connected, and they're not sort of separate compartmentalised conflicts. They're absolutely connected, and they're bound up with the US drive to establish a complete dominance across the world. They're opposing China because they see China as an economic threat. They're involved in Israel because they want to control the Middle East, and they're backing the US against Russia because They basically want to decimate Russia and seize the the resources that exist there. So there is a conscious strategy at work here, and so we can't sort of go back to the position that was put and that the mainstream media continually put that the war in the Ukraine started on the day that Russia sort of invaded. You can't analyse a war and understand a war according to who fired the first shot. And as we've spoken about, the preparations for the war in Ukraine were laid nearly a decade before with the Maidan coup. And perhaps it's worth just going through a few details about that.
Yes, do.
Yeah, the Maidan coup was basically organised in Washington and Berlin with the assistance of the CIA. They got rid of the pro-Russian regime, which was led by Viktor Yankovich. And behind this, they were working very closely with a bunch of neo-fascist parties, such as the Svoboda Party. And the Svoboda Party went right back to the Nazi collaborators in the Second World War around a guy called Stepan Bandera. So these were the forces that they were working with in 2014 when the pro-Russian government of Yankovich was overthrown. And Zelensky was installed in Kiev. After the coup, there was a whole series of events, and as you said, the surrounding of Russia by NATO. There was, the Russia tried to annex Crimea, and there was a war in the Donbass where 3,400 people were killed, it was part of the program really of Washington and Berlin to install a regime that would do their bidding, and that's that's what happened. So these events have been unfolding for some time, and in the end, I mean, Tom will possibly want to talk a bit more about this. This is all bound up with the collapse of the USSR. The USSR was dismantled in 1991. It was, in Moscow there was there was an elite, a big business elite of oligarchs put into office, and the collapse of the USSR was really the ultimate cause of the current crisis. But as I say, the main point I wanted to make was that we are now dealing with a situation that is really tobogganing towards a third world war, because just in the last few weeks, you've had Paris and Berlin and NATO and Britain involved, now talking about putting troops on the ground, NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. Biden has previously said, well, if that was to happen, it basically amounts to World War III. What we're talking about is is the possibility of a war between nuclear armed powers. The situation is really very dangerous. And
I just want to mention a thing about World War III, and just to people who may be listening and thinking, Ukraine, Russia, whatever, that's too far away. It's like, well, no, because yes, people are talking about World War III, and you can goddamn bet if there's something known as World War III which occurs, this stank government in this country is going to join with whoever the US is fighting, whatever side they are on. And people should also be aware, or recall this chap, Kane Tatai, who was killed in combat in March 2023 over there in Ukraine. We got foolish people here that want to go over there and fight alongside a bunch of Nazis.
Yes.
You know, and this guy here, it sounds like he got a Maori name there. It's like, what? Didn't our ancestors, Maori, you know, like to speak about going and fighting against the Nazis? And then you got some guy over there who's the ignorance, the level of ignorance in this country, and I guess around the world too. You know, people that listen and watch mainstream media, I have no idea. Anyways, back to you. I just wanted to mention that. Or
that's a good point, because New Zealand is absolutely involved, and under the Ardern government, they sent, I think, 200 New Zealand soldiers over to Great Britain, where they are still stationed, or at least 100 of them, and they are helping to train Ukrainian conscripts who are being sent to the front lines to fight against Russia. So New Zealand is absolutely involved, and possibly there's even more involved than we're being told, because we're not told everything, particularly when it comes to the SAS and the spy agencies and their activities. But as a member of the Five Eyes intelligence network and an ally of US imperialism, New Zealand is involved. And this, exactly right, that what happens in this war affects every part of the world. I think, you know, just want to return a bit to the case of Bogdan Syrotiuk and what it shows, because we've obtained the World Socialist website has obtained the documents that the Ukrainian security police have written out their charges against him, and against not just him, but against the World Socialist website, the International Committee of the Fourth International, and the Young Guard of Bolshevik Leninists, which is Bogdan's group in Ukraine and Russia. And what they say is, quote, is that over the past 2 years, Bogdan has, quote, engaged in the preparation of publications commissioned by representatives of a Russian propaganda and information agency, the World Socialist website. And they go on saying that the WSWS has conducted an active information war against Ukraine on behalf of Russia, and that we use so-called left-wing propagandists and their information platforms, websites, media and social platforms to discredit the support of Ukraine by international partners, justify Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine, accusing Western countries of creating conditions under which Russia was forced to launch the so-called special military operation, and basically, in other words, that our website and everyone who writes for it are Russian agents and propagandists. Mm-hmm. Now, however, I mean, it's absurd. They don't provide a shred of evidence for any of this. It's completely made up. I mean, basically anyone who opposes the war policies of the Zelensky regime is being accused of being a Russian agent at this point. But they also say, and they quote some of our statements published on the World Socialist website in these charging documents. They say that we are fighting for an international program of socialist revolution. And which is true, of course. That is what we stand for.
Nothing wrong with that.
But it totally contradicts the fact. I mean, the fact is, you know, the claim that we are somehow acting on behalf of Russia. I mean, you know, the political principles that we uphold are the unification of the working class against every capitalist government. We are not taking the side of Russia, as John was saying, any more than we take the side of Ukraine. And we insist you cannot stop this war. You can't stop US imperialism by lining up with Moscow, and you know, and obviously US imperialism is not defending democracy in Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination.
Not that it's not that it's democratic in the US either.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and we can talk a bit more about that, but they are. I mean, in fact, the United States Department, the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, comes out with these regular reports about the state of human rights in different countries around the world, and they made a number of comments that we've cited about what the reality of life actually is in Ukraine, and it's accurate. They say, quote, "This is the United States, Ukraine's main ally and funder and weapons provider," and they say among the human rights issues in Ukraine are, quote, "enforced disappearance, torture, and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, arbitrary arrest or detention, serious problems with the independence of the judiciary, restrictions on freedom of expression, including for members of the media, including violence or threats of violence against journalists, unjustified arrests or prosecutions of journalists, and censorship."
Wait a minute. Are you talking about Ukraine? Are you sure you're not talking about the United Snakes or KKK right there?
Well, you know, this is a global process, and exactly that is, you know, you've got every imperialist power, as we can see in the crackdown that's happening now against the protesters who are protesting against genocide in Gaza.
Oh yes, the students.
Yeah,
in particular.
The student encampments in particular. There's a criminalisation of any form of dissent, and what they are trying to do, you could say, is to impose the conditions that exist in Ukraine and in Israel again all over the world. They're trying to criminalise opposition to imperialist war and genocide, and that is another connection that's worth making between the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza.
I find the whole situation interesting, especially because of the nuclear weapons. You know, if there was a draft in this country, it wouldn't surprise me. There's practically what you can call happening in Ukraine is a draft, a forced draft.
Absolutely.
You're forcibly drafted into the army. And this, speaking of Russia as well, also here on the Reuters.com, at least 19,855 people have been detained in Russia for expressing anti-war views since Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. 2022. I thought he was still under the military, whatever he was calling it, exercise in 2022. But whatever, that's what you get from Reuters. Right?
Yeah, well,
You know.
well, that's probably true, but it's equally true in Ukraine. Thousands and thousands of people have been detained for what are basically thought crimes, right? I mean, that's what Bogdan has been detained for. It's not for, you know, trying to sabotage anything or trying to assassinate anybody or to, you know, do anything violent at all. It's simply for writing articles and distributing them and expressing his opinions and engaging in political activities.
It's interesting to see how this government here may, you know, behave in the same way. I mean, it feels as though it has to. It always has to echo what its big brother bullies do, shall I say. And whether they'd, you know, if I was on a, say, mainstream radio station, well, there's no way I could be with my attitude. But if I was, I'd be a target of any, you know, in this type of thing. You guys obviously are.
Well, we are, absolutely. And what this shows is they are particularly afraid of socialist perspectives that call for the unity of Russian and Ukrainian workers, because both sides are seeking to whip up nationalist hatred between these two peoples who, you know, have lived side by side forever and were recently part of the Soviet Union together. And have no interest at all in massacring each other for the sake of the profits of their ruling classes. War and revolution go hand in hand, and I think that's what the ruling classes are terrified of. And to bring it back to where we started, that's why they've arrested our socialist comrade Bogdan Syrotiuk, and sent a message in doing this arrest. And you can bet that the Ukrainians coordinated with the intelligence agencies in Germany and the United States when they arrested Bogdan, and they accused the World Socialist website of spreading Russian propaganda. This was a carefully planned operation to try and intimidate any socialist opposition, because that's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that there's a massive anti-war movement already emerging internationally, and this could develop into a movement not just against the Gaza genocide, but against what's happening in Ukraine and the whole imperialist system. And if that happens, then there's a real possibility for socialist revolution. And that's so you know, there's enormous dangers of world war, of dictatorship, of fascism, but there's also enormous desire for change and potential for the working class to mobilize for socialism, which is the alternative. And so that's why I would again just urge your listeners to sign our petition and read about our campaign. Go to change.org/freebogdan and the World Socialist website wsws.org.